Picture a teenage girl in medieval Siena, living in a tiny room in her family's home, spending hours in prayer and fasting. Catherine developed a practical theology of walking on 2 feet, love of God and love of neighbor, as the way to live a unified spiritual life. Catherine seemed destined for a life of quiet contemplation. But then something shifted. A mystical commission in her early 20s prompted her move from the cell to the streets. The same young woman who once hid from the world began caring for plague victims with her bare hands. She wrote letters to popes, helping to shape reforms at the highest levels of the church. What transformed this solitary mystic into a fearless reformer? Tonight, we'll follow Catherine's journey, beginning with the moment that first opened her eyes to heaven. Around age 7, Catherine was walking slowly through Siena's narrow stone streets, her mind still buzzing from her visit to her married sister. The afternoon sun cast long shadows between the tall buildings. She kicked at loose pebbles and hummed softly to herself, in no hurry to reach home where chores and lessons waited. As she rounded a familiar corner near the Dominican church, something made her stop walking. Catherine looked up at the sky above the city rooftops and froze completely. There, suspended in the air like a living painting, she saw Jesus Christ himself. He wore white robes and the tall hat of a pope, his face radiant with divine light. Around him stood 3 men she somehow knew were the apostles Peter, Paul, and John, their faces glowing with heavenly joy. Jesus looked directly at Catherine. His eyes met hers with such love and warmth that she felt her heart might burst. The vision seemed to last forever and only a moment at the same time. Then, as quietly as it had appeared, the heavenly scene faded from the sky above Siena. Catherine stood alone on the empty street, her small hands trembling. She ran the rest of the way home, bursting through the door with flushed cheeks and bright eyes. Catherine found her mother, Lapa, in the kitchen preparing the evening meal. The words tumbled out as she tried to describe what she had seen floating above the city. She spoke of Jesus dressed as the Pope, of the holy apostles surrounding him, of the love that had filled her entire body during those sacred moments. Her biographer Raymond of Capua would later record this vision of Christ, robed in papal vesture. An image that would prove significant when Catherine began her bold correspondence with actual popes years later. But at 7 years old, she could only describe what her eyes had witnessed with perfect clarity and complete confidence. Her family's reaction was swift and skeptical. When her father Giacomo came home from his cloth dyeing business, Lapa told him about their daughter's strange tale. Her older siblings gathered around to hear the story. Some laughed and teased Catherine about her wild imagination. Others looked worried that their little sister might be troubled in some way. But Catherine never changed her story, never admitted to making it up, never showed any doubt about what she had witnessed. The vision planted something deep in Catherine's young heart. She began waking earlier each morning to spend time in prayer before the rest of the family stirred. She would kneel beside her small bed and whisper quietly to God, sometimes for an hour or more. Her brothers and sisters noticed she no longer joined their noisy games or showed interest in the toys and dolls that had once delighted her. Catherine started visiting the local churches more often, slipping away from home to kneel before statues of Jesus and Mary. She would stare at their painted faces for long periods, as if searching for something she had lost. The priests began recognizing the small, serious girl who came to pray so frequently and so fervently. At home, Catherine's behavior puzzled everyone. She would sit quietly during family meals, eating little and speaking even less. When her mother asked what was wrong, Catherine would only say she was thinking about God. She began giving away her small portions of food to beggars who passed by their door, claiming she was not hungry. Most strangely, her family members started hearing Catherine talking in her room when she was supposedly alone. They would listen at her door and hear her side of what sounded like a conversation. She would speak softly, then pause as if listening to a response, then speak again. When they asked who she was talking to, Catherine would say simply that she was praying. Her parents watched their daughter's transformation with growing amazement and concern. The playful, chattering child they had known was becoming someone quieter, more thoughtful, more focused on invisible realities than the everyday world around her. Catherine spent more and more time alone, yet she seemed happier than ever before. Catherine never forgot the feeling of being seen and loved by Jesus himself. That moment of direct divine attention became the foundation stone of her entire spiritual life. She would spend her remaining years trying to return to that state of perfect connection with God, seeking always to feel again the overwhelming love she had experienced as a child. But her family's reaction to her vision taught Catherine something important too. She learned that not everyone would understand or believe her spiritual experiences. She discovered that the deepest truths of her heart would often seem like foolishness to others. This early lesson in discretion would serve her well in the challenging years ahead. Catherine's childhood vision established a pattern that would define her entire life. She would receive extraordinary spiritual gifts, then use those gifts to serve God and neighbor in practical ways. The same child who saw Jesus in the sky would grow up to see Jesus in the faces of plague victims, prisoners, and poor people throughout Siena. Her mystical experiences would always lead her toward greater service to others. The 7-year-old who walked home alone that day had no idea she was beginning a journey that would take her to the highest levels of church hierarchy and political power. But already the transformation was beginning, and it would soon create serious tension in her family home as Catherine grew from a mystical child into a determined young woman with her own ideas about her future. By age 16, Catherine's spiritual intensity had reached a breaking point with her family's expectations. Her parents Giacomo and Lapa had made their decision. Their daughter had spent enough years lost in prayer and strange spiritual experiences. The time had come for Catherine to marry and settle into the life God intended for young women. Lapa approached Catherine one morning as she knelt in prayer beside her bed. She explained the family's plans with excitement and pride. Catherine would meet her potential husband soon, and if things went well, they could begin planning a wedding within months. Lapa had already started imagining grandchildren and the joy of seeing Catherine settled in her own household. Catherine listened in complete silence, her eyes fixed on the small wooden cross that hung on her bedroom wall. When Lapa finished speaking, Catherine finally turned to face her mother. She spoke in a calm, quiet voice that carried absolute certainty. She would not marry any man because she had already given herself completely to Jesus Christ. Catherine explained that her childhood vision had been a calling, not just a beautiful spiritual experience. She belonged to God alone and could never become any earthly man's wife. Lapa stared at her daughter in shock and growing anger. Giacomo joined the heated discussion when he returned home that evening. He tried reasoning with Catherine, explaining the practical realities of life for unmarried women in medieval Italy. Without a husband's protection and support, Catherine would face poverty and social isolation. Catherine remained unmoved by her parents' arguments and pleas. The next morning, she made a decision that shocked everyone in the household. She took her mother's sharp sewing scissors and walked to the small mirror in her room. Catherine gathered her beautiful long hair in one hand and began cutting. The thick, dark strands fell to the floor around her feet as she worked steadily and deliberately. When she emerged from her room, Catherine's family stared in horror. Her cropped hair made her look like a young boy or a woman who had committed some terrible crime. In medieval Siena, only nuns cut their hair so short, and Catherine had not joined any religious order. She had simply destroyed the very thing that made her attractive to potential husbands. Giacomo felt his patience finally break. If Catherine wanted to behave like a rebellious child, he would treat her like one. He ordered her to take over all the household servant duties that the family usually hired help to complete. Catherine would scrub floors, wash laundry, prepare meals, and clean chambers until she came to her senses and agreed to marriage. Catherine accepted her punishment with perfect calm. She rose before dawn each morning to begin her work, moving quietly through the house while everyone else slept. She scrubbed the stone floors on her hands and knees, carried heavy buckets of water from the well, and stirred pots of soup over the kitchen fire. But Catherine discovered something wonderful in her new life of service. She began talking to Jesus while she worked, turning each chore into a form of prayer. As she swept dust from corners, she asked God to sweep sin from her heart. While she washed dishes, she prayed for the cleansing of her soul. The hard physical labor became a way to draw closer to God rather than a burden to endure. Her family watched in amazement as Catherine completed every task without complaint or resentment. She sang softly while she worked and seemed genuinely happy despite the harsh conditions they had imposed on her. Catherine never asked for help with heavy lifting or expressed frustration when her brothers and sisters made extra messes for her to clean. Months passed with Catherine working as the family servant while maintaining her commitment to prayer and fasting. She would rise at midnight to pray in silence, then begin her household duties at dawn. Her dedication never wavered, and her peaceful spirit remained unbroken despite the physical exhaustion. Around this time, Catherine joined the Dominican Third Order, known as the Mantellate, at about age 16 in 1363. These lay women lived religious lives while remaining in their family homes, which helped explain Catherine's unusual path to her parents and neighbors. The Mantellate sisters taught Catherine to read, giving her access to religious texts that would later influence her spiritual writings. Gradually, the family began to accept Catherine's religious vocation. Her parents realized that their daughter's calling was genuine and that fighting against it only brought suffering to everyone. They decided to give her the small room at the back of the house where she could pray and fast in peace. The family would respect her choice to remain unmarried and support her spiritual path. Catherine received the news with quiet gratitude. She moved her few possessions into the tiny chamber that would become her sanctuary. The room contained only a simple wooden bed, a small table, and a window that looked out on their garden. Catherine covered the walls with religious images and arranged her prayer books on the table. In this humble space, Catherine began the most intensive period of spiritual growth in her life. She spent hours each day in prayer and meditation, rarely leaving the room except for church services. Her family brought her small portions of food, which she ate sparingly while continuing her strict fasting practices. The little room became Catherine's training ground for everything that would follow. Here she learned to hear God's voice clearly and to understand her calling to serve both church and world. For 4 years, Catherine lived this hidden life of prayer and contemplation, preparing for something she could not yet imagine. But in 1367, everything would change with a vision that would transform her from a reclusive mystic into a public servant of God. Catherine knelt in her small prayer room on a February morning around age 21, 4 years after her family had given her this sacred space. The hours she spent in prayer had deepened into something beyond ordinary devotion. The wooden walls around her seemed to fade as she entered the quiet place where she met God most clearly. As Catherine prayed that morning, the familiar stillness of her room began to change. A gentle light filled the space, soft and warm like early sunshine through spring leaves. Catherine kept her eyes closed, but she could sense movement around her, as if invisible guests were entering her tiny chamber. When she finally opened her eyes, Catherine found herself surrounded by heavenly visitors. Jesus Christ stood directly before her, his face radiant with love and joy. To his right stood the Virgin Mary, her blue robes flowing like gentle water around her feet. To his left was King David, the ancient psalmist, holding his golden harp and smiling with fatherly kindness. Catherine felt no fear, only wonder and deep peace. These were not strangers interrupting her prayer but beloved friends she had known through years of quiet conversation. Jesus stepped closer to where she knelt on the stone floor. In his hands, he held something that caught the heavenly light and sparkled like captured starfire. The ring seemed to be made of pure light itself, with tiny jewels that shifted and danced like living flames. As Jesus held it up for her to see, Catherine understood that this was no ordinary piece of jewelry but a symbol of divine love that human eyes could barely comprehend. Jesus spoke to Catherine with the voice she had learned to recognize in the depths of her heart. He told her that this ring would mark their mystical marriage, binding her soul to his in a covenant that would last beyond earthly death. Mary and David watched with joy as Jesus took Catherine's right hand and gently slid the ring onto her finger. Catherine experienced the mystical ring as completely real, though it remained visible to her alone. She could feel its gentle weight and warmth constantly. When she moved her hand, she sensed the ring's presence like a loving touch that never ended. Jesus explained to Catherine that this mystical marriage would change everything about how she lived and served. Until now, she had focused mainly on her personal relationship with God through prayer and fasting. But marriage always creates new responsibilities and connections. As his bride, Catherine would need to care for everyone Jesus loved, which meant caring for all of humanity. Mary stepped forward to embrace Catherine, welcoming her as a daughter and explaining what this new calling would require. Catherine would leave her prayer room and walk into the streets of Siena. She would seek out people who were suffering, sick, lonely, or forgotten. She would touch their lives with the same love Jesus had shown her during years of private prayer. King David struck a chord on his harp, and the music that filled the room sounded like all the joy in heaven condensed into pure sound. He told Catherine that her life would become a song of service, with each act of kindness adding another note to the melody God was composing through her hands and heart. Christ commissioned Catherine directly to leave her seclusion and serve the sick while preaching reform to both church and world. As the vision faded and the heavenly visitors departed, Catherine sat alone in her room, staring at her right hand. The ring remained invisible to others, but she could feel its presence as clearly as her own heartbeat. She understood that her life had just taken a dramatic turn from solitude towards service. That very afternoon, Catherine did something that shocked her entire family. She left her prayer room and walked out the front door of their house. For 4 years, she had barely ventured beyond their garden. Now she walked purposefully through Siena's busy streets, looking for people who needed help. Catherine found an elderly woman struggling to carry heavy buckets of water from the public well. Without a word, she took the buckets and carried them to the woman's door. She discovered a sick child whose mother had no money for medicine and gave the family her own small coins. She sat beside a dying beggar and held his hand while he breathed his last breath. Her family watched these changes with amazement and concern. Giacomo and Lapa had grown accustomed to their daughter's life of prayer and fasting. They understood mystical experiences and religious devotion. But this new pattern of public service worried them. Catherine was walking into dangerous neighborhoods and touching people with contagious diseases. Catherine tried to explain to her family what had happened during her mystical marriage. She told them that loving God truly meant loving everyone God had created. She could no longer stay hidden in her room while people suffered in the streets around their house. The ring on her finger reminded her constantly that she belonged not just to Jesus but to everyone Jesus loved. Her brothers and sisters noticed that Catherine seemed more energetic and purposeful than ever before. The years of intense prayer had prepared her for this new phase of active service. She moved through the city with quiet confidence, as if she knew exactly where God wanted her to go and what He wanted her to do. The mystical marriage had transformed Catherine's understanding of spiritual life completely. She realized that contemplation and action were not separate paths but two aspects of the same calling. Deep prayer led naturally to compassionate service, while serving others drew her into even deeper prayer. Catherine began attracting followers who wanted to learn from her example. Young men and women started joining her daily visits to the sick and poor. They watched her pray with dying strangers and share her food with hungry families. They saw how naturally she moved between quiet prayer and active mercy. But as her ministry in Siena grew, Catherine began to notice something troubling about the people who came to learn from her. Some spent all their time in church praying but ignored the hungry beggars outside. Others worked constantly to help the poor but never took time for personal prayer. Both groups seemed to struggle and stumble in their faith journey. Catherine began developing a simple teaching that would become the foundation of everything she shared with others. In prayer, she had received a revelation about God's two great commandments to love God and love neighbor. She understood that, "On 2 feet you must walk my way," as she would later describe this divine instruction. Catherine explained that walking through spiritual life requires 2 healthy feet working together. She would teach this lesson by asking her followers to imagine trying to walk forward with only 1 foot steady, wobbling and nearly falling as they pictured the unsteady journey. Many religious teachers of Catherine's time insisted that serious Christians had to choose one path or the other. Monastics locked themselves away from the world to focus completely on prayer and contemplation. Others threw themselves into charitable works but dismissed quiet spiritual practices as selfish or lazy. Catherine watched both groups with growing concern. She saw contemplatives who became so focused on their inner spiritual experiences that they lost touch with human suffering around them. These people could spend hours discussing theology but walked past starving children without offering help. Their prayers became empty words because they forgot that God lived in other people as well as in their hearts. Catherine also observed activists who worked tirelessly for good causes but gradually lost their spiritual center. These servants started strong but slowly burned out because they tried to love others without first receiving God's love for themselves. They became angry and bitter when their efforts failed to solve every problem they encountered. The first foot, Catherine taught, represents love of God expressed through prayer, fasting, reading scripture, and quiet contemplation. This foot keeps us connected to the source of all love and strength. Without regular prayer, we eventually run out of energy and patience for serving others. We start trying to help people with our own limited resources instead of drawing from God's endless supply of grace. Catherine demonstrated this principle in her own daily routine. Every morning, she spent several hours in her small room talking with God, reading spiritual books, and sitting in peaceful silence. She never skipped these quiet times even when urgent needs called for her attention. Her followers learned that Catherine's morning prayers were not selfish indulgence but necessary preparation for afternoon service. The second foot represents love of neighbor shown through acts of mercy, justice, and compassionate service. This foot moves us out of ourselves and into the world where God's love needs to be shared. Without active service to others, our prayers become self-centered conversations that never mature into real holiness. Catherine proved this point by spending her afternoons walking through Siena's poorest neighborhoods. She visited prisoners in dark cells, fed sick people who could not leave their beds, and comforted grieving families who had lost children. Her evening prayers always included specific people she had met during the day, and particular needs she had witnessed on the streets. She taught her followers that trying to walk on only one foot leaves you hopping and unsteady in your faith. People who focus exclusively on prayer often become proud and judgmental toward those who seem less spiritual. People who focus only on action often become frustrated and exhausted because they forget where their strength comes from. True spiritual maturity requires both feet working together in perfect harmony. Deep prayer gives us the love and energy we need for serving others. Active service keeps our prayers grounded in real human need instead of floating away into abstract ideas. Each foot strengthens and supports the other throughout our spiritual journey. Catherine watched her followers carefully to see how well they learned this lesson. She noticed that people who balanced prayer and service remained joyful and peaceful even during difficult times. They could handle criticism without becoming defensive and could face failure without losing hope. Their faith had solid ground to stand on because it rested on both divine love and human compassion. She also observed that contemplation and action actually strengthened each other rather than competing for time and attention. People who prayed regularly became more effective servants because they could see clearly what God wanted them to do. People who served actively became better at prayer because they met God personally in the faces of those they helped. Catherine's own life provided the perfect example of this balanced approach. Her mystical experiences gave her courage to challenge powerful leaders and comfort dying strangers. Her work with plague victims and prisoners deepened her understanding of God's mercy and justice. Neither aspect of her calling made sense without the other. Her followers began organizing their own lives around the two-foot principle. They started each day with prayer and ended each evening reflecting on how they had served others. They joined Catherine for morning contemplation and afternoon visits to hospitals and homes. Slowly, they learned to walk steadily through their spiritual lives without hopping or stumbling. The teaching spread beyond Catherine's immediate circle as people shared this practical wisdom with friends and family members. Christians throughout Siena began understanding that they did not have to choose between loving God and loving neighbor. They could do both fully by walking carefully on two healthy feet. Tonight, as you rest, consider how you might take one small step on each foot. Spend one quiet minute in gratitude toward God, thanking Him for His love and presence in your life. Then tomorrow, offer one simple act of kindness to someone around you. Let these gentle steps become your own way of walking with 2 feet steady. Catherine knew her followers would soon need this balance more than ever. The lessons they were learning in peaceful practice would be tested when circumstances arrived that would make many others run away in terror. When plague struck Siena again, the news reached Catherine's house on a gray morning. Merchants arriving from Florence brought whispered reports of entire neighborhoods emptying within days. Families who had survived earlier outbreaks now faced the same terror again. Death was moving through Italy like a dark wind, and it would soon reach their city gates. Within weeks, the first victims appeared in Siena's hospitals and homes. People recognized the signs immediately. High fever that burned through entire bodies. Swollen lumps that grew larger each day. Most frightening of all was how quickly the disease moved from person to person, jumping between family members faster than anyone could escape. Fear gripped every corner of the city. Wealthy families packed their belongings and fled to country estates far from infected areas. Shopkeepers shuttered their businesses and barricaded themselves inside their homes with stored food and water. Even priests and nuns, who normally cared for the sick and dying, began avoiding the hospitals where plague victims lay in pain. The streets that once bustled with daily commerce grew quiet except for the sound of wooden carts carrying bodies to mass burial sites outside the city walls. Neighbors stopped greeting each other, afraid that conversation might spread the deadly sickness. Children were forbidden to play together. Markets closed early as vendors worried about contaminated coins and goods. Catherine listened to these reports while sitting in her small prayer room. She heard about families locked in their houses, leaving plague victims to die alone without comfort or care. She learned that hospital workers had abandoned their posts, too terrified to touch patients who begged for water and food. The city's most vulnerable people faced death in complete isolation. Her followers gathered around Catherine, asking what they should do during this crisis. Some suggested that their small group should retreat to a monastery in the countryside until the plague passed. Others recommended staying home and praying for the city from a safe distance. Everyone agreed that walking into infected areas would be dangerous and possibly foolish. Catherine stood up from her kneeling place and walked to the window that looked out on Siena's ancient streets. She could see people hurrying past with cloth covering their faces, keeping far apart from each other as they moved quickly toward their destinations. The normal sounds of laughter, conversation, and daily business had vanished from the neighborhood. She turned back to her followers and spoke quietly but firmly. Christ had touched lepers when everyone else avoided them. He had embraced people with contagious diseases and never worried about his own safety. If they truly wanted to follow Jesus, they would go where he would go and serve the people he would serve. That meant walking directly into the hospitals where plague victims needed care. Some of her followers tried to change Catherine's mind. They reminded her that she could serve God in many ways without risking death from plague. They pointed out that her spiritual ministry would end completely if she became sick and died. They begged her to consider wearing gloves and face coverings if she insisted on visiting infected areas. Catherine refused all precautions. She explained that real love could not maintain careful distance from the people it claimed to serve. If Christ was truly present in suffering people, then touching plague victims meant touching Christ himself. She would not wear gloves when embracing Jesus, no matter what form he took in the world. Early the next morning, Catherine walked through Siena's empty streets toward the hospital of Santa Maria della Scala. Her footsteps echoed against stone walls as she moved through neighborhoods that had become ghost towns overnight. She pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped into rooms filled with the sounds of pain and the smell of sickness and death. The few remaining workers stared in amazement as Catherine moved from bed to bed, touching plague victims with her bare hands. She fed soup to people too weak to lift spoons to their mouths. She washed infected wounds with clean water and soft cloth. She held cups of water to cracked lips and helped dying patients sip slowly. Catherine spent entire nights sitting beside strangers as they breathed their final breaths. She sang quiet prayers and hymns to comfort people who faced death alone and afraid. She held their hands as fever burned through their bodies and whispered words of hope about God's love and mercy. Many people died peacefully with Catherine's gentle voice as the last sound they heard on earth. Her followers watched in wonder and growing concern. Catherine worked longer hours than the hospital's paid staff ever had, moving through wards with tireless energy. She touched the most contagious patients without hesitation. Contemporary accounts report that she remained healthy while working among the sick, though whether through divine protection or natural constitution, no one could say with certainty. Word of Catherine's fearless service spread throughout the city. People began calling her presence among plague victims remarkable. Some said that God shielded her from disease because of her pure heart and complete trust. Others believed that her prayers created protection around her body. Catherine herself never claimed special immunity or miraculous protection. She simply continued moving through hospital wards, prison cells, and private homes where plague had struck. She brought food, water, medicine, and most importantly, human companionship to people who had been abandoned by almost everyone else in their lives. Her bedside presence and tireless care during the outbreak greatly enhanced her reputation and drew many new followers who witnessed her courage. The plague eventually passed, leaving Siena forever changed. Hundreds had died, families had been destroyed, and the city's population was significantly smaller. But those who survived remembered the woman who had walked fearlessly among the sick when everyone else ran away in terror. Catherine's example proved that genuine love of God expressed itself naturally through fearless love of neighbor, even when that love required ultimate sacrifice. Her compassion during the plague crisis established Catherine's reputation throughout central Italy. Leaders in distant cities heard stories about the Holy Woman of Siena, who touched untouchable people and brought comfort to the most desperate situations. People began seeking her out for spiritual guidance and wisdom. Soon, something unexpected would begin happening in her family's house that would challenge everything medieval society believed about who could teach and who must listen. People from every corner of Siena began arriving at the Benincasa family door, seeking not medical help or charity, but wanting to sit with Catherine and listen to her speak about God. These visitors came from every level of the city's social structure, creating gatherings that would have been impossible anywhere else in medieval Italy. The first to join Catherine regularly was a Dominican friar named Raymond of Capua, who had watched her work among plague victims with growing amazement. Raymond was an educated priest with years of theological training, yet he found himself learning from this laywoman who had never attended university or read scholarly books about God. He began bringing other clergy members to hear Catherine's simple but profound insights about prayer and service. Word spread through Siena's university that a young woman was teaching spiritual lessons with unusual wisdom and clarity. Professor Tommaso Dalla Fonte, who had known Catherine since childhood, started attending her informal gatherings. He brought fellow academics who were curious about this unschooled woman who seemed to understand complex theological ideas better than many trained scholars. Catherine's growing circle also included noblewomen like Alessia Saraceni, who left her comfortable palace to sit on simple wooden benches in the Benincasa family home. These wealthy ladies found themselves listening alongside common laborers, craftsmen, and servants who also sought Catherine's guidance. In medieval society, such mixing of social classes almost never happened, especially around religious teaching. Young artists, poets, and writers came to hear her speak about divine love in language that was both beautiful and accessible. They called themselves Catherine's spiritual family, using the same word they would use for blood relatives. The most surprising members of Catherine's family were the men who began accepting her as their teacher. Medieval culture strictly forbade women from instructing men, particularly in religious matters. Church law stated clearly that women should remain silent and receive teaching from male authorities. Catherine had never received permission to teach anyone, yet respected men were voluntarily sitting at her feet like students. This unusual arrangement began attracting attention from church officials in Siena. Dominican authorities heard reports about the growing influence of an uneducated laywoman who was gathering mixed groups of clergy and lay people around her. They worried that Catherine might be spreading dangerous ideas or claiming authority that belonged only to ordained priests. Catherine's family watched nervously as their daughter's reputation grew beyond their small circle. They knew that women who stepped outside traditional roles often faced serious consequences from both church and civil authorities. Some families had seen their daughters accused of heresy or witchcraft for claiming special spiritual gifts or teaching others without permission. The tension reached its peak when Dominican officials decided to investigate Catherine formally. In 1374, she was summoned to appear before the Dominican General Chapter, where a panel of theologians and bishops would examine her teachings and determine whether she was operating within acceptable boundaries. Catherine's followers worried that she might be forbidden to continue her ministry or even face more serious punishment. Catherine prepared for this examination by spending extra time in prayer, asking God to give her the right words to speak. She felt no fear about defending her calling, but she understood the gravity of the situation. The church had the power to silence her completely if officials decided she was overstepping her proper role as a laywoman. On the day of her examination, Catherine walked into a room filled with learned men who had spent years studying theology and church law. They questioned her carefully about her spiritual experiences, her teachings, and her authority to gather followers. Some seemed genuinely curious about her insights, while others appeared skeptical or even hostile. Catherine answered every question with quiet confidence and remarkable wisdom. She explained her mystical experiences without claiming they made her superior to church authority. She described her teachings as simple reminders of truths that could be found in scripture and tradition. She emphasized that she sought only to help people love God and neighbor more fully. What amazed the examining officials most was Catherine's ability to discuss complex theological concepts with perfect orthodoxy despite her lack of formal education. She spoke about the nature of God, the purpose of prayer, and the relationship between contemplation and action with depth that matched trained scholars. Her answers revealed not just intelligence but authentic spiritual maturity. The bishops and theologians conferred privately about Catherine's case. They had expected to find either dangerous errors in her teaching or excessive claims about her own authority. Instead, they discovered a woman whose insights aligned perfectly with church doctrine and whose influence seemed to draw people closer to authentic Christian life. After careful deliberation, the Dominican authorities cleared Catherine of all charges. Raymond of Capua was officially assigned to serve as her confessor, legitimizing her activity within the order. Raymond would later write her major biography, the Legenda Major, which became the principal source for many details of her life and teachings. This ecclesiastical approval transformed Catherine's influence completely. News of the Dominican endorsement spread throughout central Italy, reaching people who had heard rumors about the Holy Woman of Siena but wondered whether her claims were authentic. Knowing that trained theologians had examined and approved her ministry gave Catherine credibility that opened doors throughout the Italian peninsula. Religious communities began inviting Catherine to visit and share her insights with their members. Political leaders started seeking her counsel on matters that touched both spiritual and temporal concerns. Her authentic holiness had broken through the rigid social barriers of medieval society, winning recognition from the very authorities who normally guarded those boundaries most carefully. Catherine's approved ministry would soon extend far beyond anyone's expectations, reaching the highest levels of church hierarchy. But first, Raymond would bring her news that would test everything she had learned about courage and faithful service. Raymond arrived with news that would transform Catherine's ministry beyond Siena's boundaries. The Pope, who should have been living in Rome where St. Peter had established his throne, was instead residing in the French city of Avignon. This situation had continued for nearly 70 years, creating confusion and division throughout all of Christianity. The papal court in France lived in luxury that scandalized many faithful Christians. Pope Gregory XI ruled the church from a magnificent palace surrounded by French nobles and advisors who cared more about political power than spiritual leadership. Meanwhile, Rome's ancient churches crumbled from neglect, and the Eternal City lost its role as Christianity's beating heart. This arrangement was tearing Europe apart through constant warfare and political scheming. French kings used their influence over the Pope to advance their own interests against other nations. Italian cities fought each other for control while the papal court remained distant and distracted. Christians throughout Europe wondered whether their spiritual father truly cared about their souls or only about maintaining his comfortable exile. Catherine listened to Raymond's explanation with growing concern and righteous anger. She had never learned to read or write, but she understood clearly that Christ's representative on earth belonged in the city where Christ's first apostle had died as a martyr. The Pope's absence from Rome represented a fundamental betrayal of his sacred calling and responsibility. That very afternoon, Catherine began dictating her first letter to Pope Gregory XI. She called for her secretary and started speaking words that came directly from her heart and prayer. Catherine addressed the Pope with deep respect, calling him "sweet Christ on earth," and acknowledging his divine authority over all Christians. But her respectful tone carried an unmistakable note of urgency and demand. She told Gregory that he must respond to the Holy Spirit's call and return immediately to Rome. Catherine described the Pope's duty to come back like a gentle lamb, laying aside the worldly concerns that kept him comfortable in France. She reminded him that Christ had chosen poverty and sacrifice, not luxury and political convenience. Her letters combined tender affection with bold confrontation in ways that shocked everyone who heard them. Catherine would eventually dictate roughly 380 letters, plus 26 prayers, and the dialogue between 1377 and 1378. Her correspondence reached popes, kings, queens, and common people throughout Europe. But her letters to Gregory XI carried special urgency because she believed the Church's future depended on the Pope's return to Rome. Her dictated words revealed remarkable theological sophistication and political understanding. Catherine grasped the complex relationships between church and state that kept the papacy trapped in French influence. She saw clearly how the Pope's exile weakened Christian unity and damaged the Church's spiritual authority throughout Europe. Gregory XI received Catherine's letters with amazement and growing respect. No one had ever written to him with such perfect balance of reverence and boldness. Most correspondence from religious figures either flattered him excessively or criticized him harshly. Catherine's letters did neither, instead speaking to him with the loving directness of someone who truly cared about his soul and his sacred calling. The Pope began responding to Catherine's letters, creating an ongoing correspondence that would change both their lives. Gregory found himself looking forward to hearing from this remarkable woman who seemed to understand his struggles better than his closest advisors. Catherine's letters came from someone who clearly lived close to God and spoke with authentic spiritual authority. Catherine continued dictating letter after letter, each one pressing the same essential message. The Pope must return to Rome not for political reasons but because Christ called him there. She wrote about the suffering of Christians who needed their spiritual father to be present in the city where Christianity had begun. She described the damage being done to the Church's mission by this prolonged exile. Her letters reached Gregory at a time when he was already questioning whether remaining in France served God's will or merely his own comfort. Other voices had called for his return to Rome, but they spoke mainly about political advantages or practical concerns. Catherine alone wrote about the spiritual necessity of the Pope living where Christ had established his church. Gregory became so impressed by Catherine's wisdom and holiness that he invited her to visit him in France. The Pope wanted to meet this extraordinary woman face to face and discuss the future of the Church with someone who clearly heard God's voice. Catherine accepted the invitation, though traveling to France would require her to leave Italy for the first time in her life. When Catherine arrived in Avignon, she found the papal court exactly as she had imagined from her prayers and correspondence. Luxury surrounded the Pope while spiritual concerns took second place to political maneuvering and worldly pleasure. Catherine walked through the magnificent palace with sadness, seeing how far the Church's leadership had drifted from Christ's example of simplicity and service. Her meetings with Pope Gregory were private, but witnesses reported that Catherine spoke to him with the same loving boldness that characterized her letters. She reminded the Pope that his authority came from God, not from French kings or political advisors. Catherine urged Gregory to trust completely in divine protection rather than human schemes and earthly security. Catherine advocated forcefully for Gregory's return and is credited by contemporaries with significant influence, though historians continue to debate the precise extent of her role. Her letters and personal advocacy were influential among many factors that persuaded Gregory to make his historic decision. In January 1377, Gregory XI returned from Avignon to Rome, ending 7 decades of papal exile. This achievement established Catherine's reputation as someone who could speak truth to the highest levels of church authority and be heard with respect. But those who watched Catherine closely during this intense period of correspondence and travel began noticing something puzzling about how she sustained such demanding work. Catherine's eating habits became one of the most puzzling aspects of her daily life for everyone who watched her closely. Her family members sat down to regular meals of bread, soup, vegetables, and meat, while Catherine would appear at the table and eat only a few small bites before quietly excusing herself. Sometimes she would take a single spoonful of broth or nibble the edge of a piece of bread, then claim she felt completely satisfied. Her followers noticed that Catherine often went entire days consuming nothing except the Eucharist she received at morning Massachusetts. She would kneel at the altar rail, receive the consecrated host on her tongue, and seem to glow with contentment as if she had just finished a feast. When they asked Catherine how she could survive on so little food, she would smile gently and explain that Christ himself was feeding her soul with everything it needed. This extreme fasting worried everyone who cared about Catherine's health and well-being. Raymond of Capua tried repeatedly to convince her to eat more substantial meals, pointing out that her demanding schedule of prayer and service required physical strength. He watched Catherine spend long hours visiting sick people, caring for prisoners, and traveling between cities, all while consuming barely enough food to keep a small child alive. Contemporaries reported she subsisted largely on the Eucharist and practiced extreme fasting, though later observers debate physical explanations for how she maintained such strength. People today understand that the human body needs regular nutrition to maintain energy, focus, and physical stamina. Most adults require thousands of calories daily just to handle ordinary work and social responsibilities, let alone the intensive ministry Catherine had undertaken. Yet Catherine seemed to draw energy from sources that defied natural explanation. She woke before dawn each morning for several hours of prayer, then spent entire days walking through Siena's streets to visit people who needed comfort or practical help. She climbed stairs to reach sick people in upper-story rooms, carried heavy buckets of water for families without servants, and stayed awake through long nights sitting with dying patients. Her physical stamina amazed everyone who tried to keep pace with her daily routine. Young men who ate hearty meals 3 times each day found themselves exhausted after following Catherine through a typical afternoon of service. They would stop to rest while she continued moving from house to house, never showing signs of fatigue or weakness despite eating almost nothing for days. Catherine worked longer hours than hospital staff who were paid to care for patients and fed regular meals by their employers. She outlasted wealthy volunteers who returned to comfortable homes and full dinner tables each evening. Even robust laborers who performed physical work for their livelihood could not match Catherine's endurance and consistent energy throughout each demanding day. When people pressed Catherine to explain how she maintained such strength without proper food, she spoke about the Eucharist with deep reverence and practical understanding. She told them that receiving Christ's body and blood in communion provided complete nourishment for both soul and body. The consecrated host contained everything she needed to live and serve because it contained Christ himself. Catherine described her experience of receiving communion as feeling physically fed and spiritually satisfied in ways that ordinary food could never accomplish. She said that when the priest placed the Eucharist on her tongue, warmth and strength flowed through her entire body. The small piece of blessed bread seemed to multiply inside her, creating energy that lasted for hours or even days. In the quiet of the chapel after receiving communion, she felt completely sustained by divine love. Her extreme fasting became much more than a physical discipline or religious obligation. Catherine used hunger as a constant form of prayer that kept her connected to Christ throughout every moment of her waking life. The empty sensation in her stomach reminded her that only God could fill the deepest needs of her heart and soul. This voluntary hunger also helped Catherine understand the involuntary hunger of poor people she served throughout Siena. When she sat beside families who had no money for bread, Catherine could truly sympathize with their physical suffering because she knew personally how hunger felt. Her empty stomach created solidarity with people whose empty stomachs came from poverty rather than choice. Catherine explained to her followers that fasting taught her to depend completely on God rather than on her own efforts or resources. Each time she felt hungry but chose not to eat, she practiced trusting that divine love would provide everything she truly needed. This lesson in dependence prepared her for much larger acts of faith and obedience throughout her ministry. Her fasting also created space in her daily schedule for additional prayer and service. While other people spent time preparing, eating, and cleaning up after meals, Catherine used those hours for spiritual conversation with God or practical care for people who needed help. She gained extra time each day by eliminating activities that most people considered absolutely necessary. The physical lightness that came from eating very little seemed to make Catherine more sensitive to spiritual realities around her. She often described feeling as if her soul could move more freely when her body was not weighed down by heavy food. This spiritual sensitivity helped her recognize God's presence in people and situations that others might overlook. Catherine's unusual relationship with food demonstrated something profound about how spiritual practices can actually increase rather than decrease our capacity for loving service. Her fasting did not make her weak and self-absorbed but strong and other-focused. The energy she gained from prayer and communion enabled charitable work that would have exhausted people who relied only on ordinary physical nourishment. Modern commentators have offered different readings of Catherine's extreme fasting, with some suggesting it contributed to her later health problems. Catherine died in Rome on April 29, 1380, after a period of illness and paralysis, and her health problems were probably linked to years of extreme austerity. Yet throughout her life, this supernatural energy sustained Catherine through increasingly demanding challenges as her influence continued growing throughout Italy. As Catherine approached 30 years of age, the same spiritual strength that carried her through daily service to sick and poor people in Siena would soon support her through the most intellectually and creatively intensive period of her entire life. Something extraordinary was about to unfold that would surprise even those who had witnessed her most remarkable spiritual gifts. Catherine began experiencing a profound shift in her prayer life around age 30. After years of intense public ministry, caring for plague victims, and traveling to meet with Pope Gregory, she found herself drawn toward deeper contemplation. But this return to solitude was different from her earlier years of hidden devotion. Now her prayer life carried the weight of all the people she had served and all the spiritual truths she had discovered through active love. She began spending longer hours in her small room, kneeling on the stone floor before her wooden cross. Catherine would enter deep states of prayer that lasted from early morning until late afternoon, barely moving from her place of communion with God. Her followers learned to leave food outside her door, knowing she might not emerge for many hours at a time. During these extended prayer periods, something extraordinary began happening. Catherine started hearing words in her heart that felt different from her usual conversations with God. These words came with such clarity and authority that she knew they were meant to be preserved and shared with others. The voice she heard was unmistakably divine, speaking truths about spiritual life with perfect wisdom and love. Catherine called for her secretaries and began dictating what she heard during prayer. She would kneel in her room, listening carefully to the divine voice, then speak aloud the words that came to her soul. Her scribes wrote quickly to capture every phrase exactly as Catherine received it. Much of the dialogue was dictated during intense ecstatic periods between 1377 and 1378 as this complete book took shape through her mystical experiences. The work that emerged was unlike anything Catherine had ever spoken before. While her letters and conversations had always shown spiritual insight, this new book demonstrated theological sophistication that amazed everyone who heard it. Catherine was dictating complex discussions about the nature of God, the purpose of human life, and the path to spiritual perfection. She told her secretaries that God was speaking directly to her soul, giving her these words as a gift for all Christians who sought deeper understanding of divine love. Catherine insisted that she was simply the instrument through which God chose to communicate these teachings. The book would belong not to her but to the Church and to every soul hungry for spiritual wisdom. The text took the form of conversations between God the Father and a soul seeking truth. Catherine dictated dialogue where the soul asked questions about prayer, virtue, suffering, and salvation, while God responded with patient explanations full of love and practical guidance. These exchanges felt intimate yet universal, addressing concerns that every serious Christian faced in their spiritual journey. One of the most powerful images Catherine received was that of Christ as the bridge between God and human beings, with 3 levels representing stages of spiritual growth. These stages describe how love matures from fear to friendship to complete union with God's will. The first level showed souls motivated by fear of punishment and hope for reward. The second revealed people who served God from genuine love rather than selfish concern. The third and highest level described souls perfectly united with divine will, serving others naturally and joyfully without internal struggle. Catherine dictated teachings about how the soul existed within God while God simultaneously lived within the soul through grace. This mutual indwelling meant that prayer was not reaching toward a distant deity but recognizing the divine presence already alive in every human heart. She explained that people often searched desperately for God while He was closer to them than their own breathing. The theological depth of Catherine's dictated words astonished scholars who examined the manuscript. She discussed concepts that required years of university study to understand, yet her explanations were clear and practical. Catherine addressed complex questions about free will, divine providence, and the relationship between contemplation and action with wisdom that matched the greatest theologians of her time. University professors who had spent decades studying religious philosophy found themselves learning from an illiterate laywoman who had never read a single theological textbook. They recognized that Catherine's insights came not from human education but from direct spiritual experience of the truth she described so beautifully. The completed book, known as the Dialogue, became one of the most important spiritual works of the medieval period. Christians throughout Europe copied and studied Catherine's teachings about the bridge to God and the 3 stages of spiritual development. Her practical wisdom about prayer and service influenced countless believers seeking to deepen their relationship with divine love. This work would later become one of the reasons she was proclaimed a Doctor of the Church in 1970. Recognizing her theological authority within the Catholic tradition, Catherine's mystical experiences had produced a literary masterpiece that guided readers through every stage of spiritual growth. The same woman who had touched plague victims with fearless compassion now offered healing words for souls struggling with doubt, discouragement, and confusion about God's will for their lives. The dialogue proved that contemplation and action truly strengthened each other in Catherine's ministry. Her years of serving others had prepared her to receive these divine teachings, while her deep prayer life enabled her to express them with perfect clarity. The book became her greatest gift to future generations seeking to walk the bridge between earth and heaven. As Catherine finished dictating the final words of her theological masterpiece, she had demonstrated something remarkable about the spiritual life. Her deepest mystical experiences had not pulled her away from loving service to others but had instead equipped her to serve with even greater wisdom and compassion. Her life and writings led to her canonization in 1461 and to being declared a Doctor of the Church in 1970, the first woman so honored along with Teresa of Avila. By 1378, Catherine had spent over a decade moving between deep contemplation in her small room and active ministry throughout central Italy. Her life had become a living example of the bridge she described in her writings, connecting heaven's love with earth's most urgent needs. Many religious people of Catherine's time still insisted that serious Christians had to choose one path or the other. Monastics argued that true holiness required complete withdrawal from worldly concerns to focus entirely on prayer and contemplation. Social reformers claimed that authentic faith expressed itself through constant action to help the poor and challenge injustice. Both groups viewed the other approach with suspicion and criticism. Catherine's daily routine proved these divisions were unnecessary and harmful. She would rise before dawn to spend several hours in prayer, often experiencing mystical visions and deep communion with God. These morning encounters with divine love did not make her want to stay hidden in her room. Instead, they filled her with such overwhelming love for God that she naturally sought ways to share that love with everyone she met throughout the day. Her afternoons of service to sick people, prisoners, and poor families did not distract her from spiritual life or make her prayers less meaningful. Every person she touched, every wound she cleaned, every dying stranger she comforted became another way of encountering the same God she met during quiet prayer. Catherine discovered that knowing God deeply in contemplation made her love people more completely, not less. The mystical experiences that filled Catherine's prayer life gave her remarkable courage for challenging powerful leaders and comforting frightened plague victims. When she received visions of Christ's love, those experiences strengthened her conviction that earthly authorities must serve divine will rather than their own comfort or political advantage. Her direct encounters with God's mercy made her more sensitive to human suffering and more determined to address it. Catherine's letters to Pope Gregory about returning to Rome came from the same spiritual source as her gentle care for dying strangers in Siena's hospitals. Both activities flowed naturally from her deep union with God in prayer. She could speak boldly to the most powerful man in Christianity because she had heard God's voice clearly during contemplation. She could touch plague victims without fear because her mystical experiences had taught her that Christ was present in every suffering person. Her followers watched this integration with growing understanding and admiration. They saw that Catherine's most intense periods of prayer prepared her for more effective service, while her demanding work with poor and sick people deepened her appreciation for God's mercy during contemplation. Each Each aspect of her calling strengthened and supported the other throughout her daily routine. Catherine began teaching her spiritual family to organize their own lives around the same pattern of balance. They learned to start each day with quiet prayer that opened their hearts to receive divine love. Then they would spend their afternoons looking for practical ways to share that love with people who needed comfort, healing, or encouragement. Their evening prayers became times to reflect on how they had met God in the faces of those they served. This balanced approach created remarkable stability in Catherine's followers during difficult times. They could handle criticism and setbacks without losing hope because their strength came from divine love rather than human approval. They remained joyful even when their charitable work seemed to make little difference because they knew their efforts pleased God regardless of visible results. Catherine herself demonstrated this stability most clearly as her body began weakening from years of extreme fasting and demanding service. Her physical strength declined noticeably during her final years, but her spiritual influence continued growing throughout Italy and beyond. People traveled from distant cities to seek her counsel and observe her example of integrated spiritual life. She spent increasing time dictating letters to church leaders, political rulers, and ordinary Christians who asked for guidance about prayer and service. Catherine's correspondence showed the same perfect balance she lived personally. She would offer practical advice about caring for sick family members or handling workplace conflicts, then conclude with encouragement to spend more time in quiet communion with God. Even as Catherine's body grew weaker, her ability to bridge different worlds seemed to expand. She brought together people who normally avoided each other: wealthy nobles and poor laborers, university professors and illiterate workers, contemplative nuns and active reformers. Her authentic holiness created space where artificial divisions disappeared and common love for God united everyone. Catherine's followers learned that mystical prayer and compassionate action were not competing demands on their time and energy but complementary expressions of the same divine calling. People who tried to pray without serving others found their spiritual lives becoming selfish and empty. People who tried to serve without regular prayer discovered their charitable work becoming angry and exhausting. The balance Catherine modeled showed that contemplation naturally led to action when it was genuine, while action naturally led to deeper prayer when it was motivated by authentic love. Her life proved that the highest forms of mystical experience expressed themselves through practical care for neighbors rather than withdrawal from human contact and responsibility. Catherine became a living bridge connecting heaven's perfect love with earth's broken places. Her mystical visions gave her strength to touch untouchable people and challenge unjust systems. Her service to suffering people deepened her understanding of God's mercy and justice. Contemplation fuels action. Action deepens contemplation. Neither aspect of her calling made complete sense without the other supporting and strengthening it. You can follow Catherine's gentle example with a simple two-step practice. Before sleep, spend 1 quiet minute in thanksgiving for God's love and presence in your life. Then tomorrow, offer 1 small act of neighborly kindness to someone around you. These gentle steps become your own way of walking with 2 feet steady. As Catherine's earthly life approached its end in 1380, she had demonstrated something revolutionary about spiritual maturity. True holiness did not require choosing between loving God and loving people. Instead, it meant discovering that these 2 loves were actually one love expressed in different directions. The Church continues to honor her witness, naming her co-patroness of Italy in 1939 and of Europe in 1999. Her legacy continues inspiring Christians for centuries, showing them how to walk steadily through their own spiritual journeys with restful trust in God's perfect plan. Catherine's simple teaching about walking on 2 feet offers you a gentle path forward tonight. You can find God in quiet moments of prayer when your house grows still. You can also meet Him in small acts of kindness toward family members, neighbors, or strangers who cross your path tomorrow. Like Catherine, you need not choose between loving God and loving people around you. These 2 loves support each other like feet working together. Your morning prayers can prepare your heart for afternoon service. Your evening care for others can deepen tonight's communion with God. Take a slow breath now and think quietly, I am loved by God. Breathe out gently with this thought, I will love my neighbor tomorrow. Reflect quietly on 1 small act of charity you can do tomorrow, and share 1 short thought in the comments if you wish. Catherine's life shows that deep devotion and small acts of mercy together make a life of holiness. Rest knowing your smallest kindnesses become steps on the bridge between heaven and earth.